On October 14, 1943, 291 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers departed England to bomb ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, Germany. The mission was part of the U.S. 8th Air Force's strategic bombing campaign to cripple German war production. The bombers flew without fighter escort for most of the mission. American P-47 Thunderbolts had insufficient range to accompany the bombers deep into Germany. German fighters intercepted the formation over the target area. In the air battle that followed, 60 B-17s were shot down. Over 600 American airmen were killed or captured. Among the casualties were the tail gunners, the men who occupied the most vulnerable position on the B-17. The tail gun position was located at the rear of the aircraft, isolated from the rest of the crew in a cramped compartment barely large enough for one man. The tail gunner sat facing backward, operating twin .50 caliber machine guns to defend the aircraft from attacks from the rear. German fighter tactics prioritized attacking from the tail, where bombers were least defended. Tail gunners were the first to see the enemy and the first to die. Tail gunners had the highest casualty rate of any crew position on B-17 bombers. Statistically, tail gunners were more likely to be killed or severely wounded than pilots, bombardiers, or other gunners. The reasons were tactical, environmental, and structural. German fighters attacked from the rear because it was the most effective approach. The tail position offered no armor protection and was exposed to direct fire. The extreme cold at operational altitude, often -50 degrees Celsius, caused frostbite and reduced the gunner's ability to operate weapons. Isolation from the crew meant tail gunners faced psychological stress alone.
This analysis examines why B-17 tail gunners had the shortest life expectancy in the Army Air Force, what they experienced during combat missions, and how they coped with the knowledge that their position was the most dangerous on the aircraft. The B-17 tail gun position was designed as a defensive station to protect the aircraft from rear attacks. The position was located in the extreme rear of the fuselage, accessed by crawling through a narrow tunnel from the waist gun section. The tail gunner sat on a bicycle-style seat, knees bent, feet braced against the fuselage walls, facing backward. The compartment measured approximately 4 feet wide, 3 feet high, and 6 feet long. Barely enough space for one man and 2 machine guns. The tail gunner operated twin Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, mounted on a flexible turret. The guns could traverse approximately 85 degrees left and right, and 60 degrees up and down, covering the rear arc of the aircraft. Ammunition was stored in metal boxes on either side of the position. The gunner aimed using a reflector sight, a simple optical device that projected a reticle onto a glass panel. Target acquisition and firing were manual. The gunner had to track fast-moving enemy fighters, lead the target to account for relative motion, and fire short bursts to conserve ammunition. The position was isolated from the rest of the crew. There was no walkway connecting the tail to the main fuselage. The gunner crawled in before takeoff and remained in position for the entire mission, often 8 to 10 hours. Communication with the crew was via intercom only. The gunner could not see other crew members, could not leave the position during flight, and had no assistance if wounded or equipment failed. The tail position had no armor protection. The fuselage skin in that section of the aircraft was thin aluminum, offering no resistance to machine gun or cannon fire. The tail gunner sat directly behind the aircraft's control surfaces, the rudder and elevators, which were also unarmored. Enemy fire aimed at the tail often struck the gunner directly. Unlike the waist gunners, who could move to avoid fire or take cover behind structural elements, the tail gunner was fixed in position. Visibility from the tail position was excellent in the rear arc, but limited elsewhere. The gunner could see enemy fighters approaching from behind, but had no view of attacks from above, below, or the sides. The gunner relied on other crew members to call out threats, but communication delays meant the tail gunner often had only seconds to respond. German fighter pilots developed tactics specifically to exploit the vulnerabilities of American bomber formations.
The standard approach was to attack from the rear, a position pilots referred to as 6 o'clock, where bombers had limited defensive firepower and the tail gunner was the only obstacle. German fighters, primarily Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s, approached bomber formations from high altitude, diving to build speed. Pilots positioned themselves directly behind a target bomber, aligning with the aircraft's centerline to minimize exposure to defensive fire from other bombers in the formation. The attack run began at a range of approximately 1,000 meters. German pilots opened fire at 400 to 600 meters, using 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns to disable the bomber before closing to point-blank range. The tail gunner was the primary target during these attacks. German pilots aimed for the tail section to eliminate defensive fire and to damage control surfaces, making the bomber uncontrollable. A single burst from a 20mm cannon could destroy the tail gun position, kill the gunner, and sever the aircraft's rudder cables. Once the tail gunner was neutralized, the bomber was defenseless against subsequent attacks.
German pilots also used head-on attacks, approaching from 12 o'clock high and firing into the nose section where the bombardier and navigator sat. However, head-on attacks were more dangerous for the fighter pilot because they exposed the fighter to fire from the bomber's front guns and from other bombers in the formation. Tail attacks allowed the German pilot to remain behind the bomber, where he was exposed to fire from only one gunner, the tail gunner. The Luftwaffe trained pilots to focus fire on the tail gunner first. Training manuals instructed pilots to aim for the tail position specifically to eliminate the gunner with the first burst. Once the tail gunner was dead or incapacitated, the bomber could be attacked repeatedly with minimal risk. This doctrine meant that tail gunners faced concentrated fire on every attack. They were not incidental casualties, but deliberate targets. The psychological impact on tail gunners was severe. Every mission, the tail gunner knew that enemy fighters would target him specifically. He knew that the first indication of an attack would be tracer rounds and cannon shells streaking toward his position. He knew that he had seconds to return fire before being hit. Many tail gunners described the experience as watching death approach and being unable to do anything but fight back and hope. B-17 bombers operated at altitudes between 20,000 and 30,000 feet, where outside air temperatures ranged from -30 to -60 degrees Celsius. The tail gun position was one of the coldest locations on the aircraft. The position was at the extreme rear, away from engines and heating systems. The compartment was not pressurized or heated. Outside air entered through gaps around the gun mounts and ventilation openings. The tail gunner was directly exposed to the slipstream. Tail gunners wore electrically heated flight suits to combat the cold. The suits had wires woven into the fabric, powered by the aircraft's electrical system. When functioning, the suits provided some warmth. However, the suits were unreliable. Wiring broke, connections failed, or the aircraft's electrical system malfunctioned. When the heated suit failed, the gunner had no protection against the cold except heavy leather jackets, wool layers, and fleece-lined boots. Frostbite was common. Exposed skin froze within minutes at high altitude. Tail gunners wore leather gloves, but the gloves reduced manual dexterity, making it difficult to operate weapons and load ammunition. Some gunners removed gloves temporarily to perform tasks requiring fine motor control, resulting in frostbite on fingers. Severe frostbite caused tissue death, requiring amputation after the mission. Hypothermia was a constant threat. Prolonged exposure to extreme cold lowered core body temperature. Symptoms included shivering, confusion, lethargy, and loss of motor control. Tail gunners experiencing hypothermia lost the ability to operate weapons effectively. Reaction times slowed, vision blurred, judgment deteriorated. Some gunners became incapacitated during missions, unable to defend the aircraft. The cold affected equipment as well. Machine gun mechanisms froze, causing jams.
Lubricating oil congealed, preventing moving parts from functioning. Ammunition became brittle in extreme cold and sometimes shattered when fired. The tail gunner had to clear jams manually, working with frozen fingers in a cramped space while under enemy attack. Tail gunners described the cold as one of the worst aspects of the mission, worse even than enemy fire in some cases. The cold was constant, inescapable, and painful. It sapped energy and reduced the gunner's ability to fight. Missions lasted 8 to 10 hours. Tail gunners endured sub-zero temperatures for the entire duration, with no opportunity to warm themselves or move to restore circulation. The tail gunner's isolation from the rest of the crew created unique psychological stress. Unlike other crew members who worked in proximity to each other and could see and interact with their comrades, the tail gunner was alone. You sat facing backward, watching the sky behind the aircraft, unable to see the rest of the crew or the mission ahead. Communication was limited to intercom radio. The gunner could hear crew chatter, pilots discussing navigation, bombardiers preparing for the bomb run, other gunners calling out enemy fighters, but he was not part of those conversations unless he transmitted. The intercom was often cluttered with urgent communications during combat. Tail gunners learned to listen carefully for calls relevant to their position, but otherwise remained silent. The psychological effect of facing backward was profound. While the rest of the crew faced forward, focused on the mission and the target ahead, the tail gunner watched what the aircraft was leaving behind. He saw other bombers in the formation falling out of position after being hit. He saw parachutes deploying, or failing to deploy, as crews abandoned stricken aircraft. He saw bombers explode in mid-air, disintegrating in seconds. He saw all of this alone, unable to turn away or shift his focus elsewhere. Tail gunners also saw German fighters before anyone else in the crew. The fighters approached from behind, positioning themselves for the attack run. The tail gunner was the first to spot them, the first to call out the warning, and the first to engage. This meant the tail gunner had more time to anticipate the attack than other crew members, but it also meant more time to experience fear. Other crew members reacted to the attack when it began. The tail gunner watched it develop, knowing what was coming and unable to do anything but wait. The knowledge that he was the primary target amplified the psychological burden. The tail gunner knew that when the fighters attacked, they would aim for him. He knew that the first bursts of cannon fire would be directed at his position. He knew that his survival depended on his ability to return fire accurately under extreme stress, cold, and fear. Many tail gunners described feeling like bait, a deliberate target placed at the rear of the aircraft to draw enemy fire. Isolation also meant that if the tail gunner was wounded, he had no immediate assistance. The crew could not reach him during flight. If he was incapacitated, the aircraft lost its rear defense. Some wounded tail gunners remained conscious long enough to continue fighting, bleeding and in pain until they lost consciousness or the mission ended. Others died alone in the tail, their bodies discovered only after the aircraft landed. A typical combat mission for a tail gunner began hours before enemy contact. The gunner crawled into the tail position during pre-flight preparation and remained there through takeoff, climb to altitude, formation assembly, and the long flight to the target. By the time German fighters appeared, the gunner had been in the cramped, freezing position for several hours. Enemy fighters were first detected as distant specks at high altitude, sometimes backlit by the sun to reduce visibility. The tail gunner reported sightings over the intercom. "Fighters, 6 o'clock high, range 2 miles. The fighters approached rapidly, closing the distance at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. The tail gunner tracked them through his gun sight, waiting for them to enter effective range. German fighters typically opened fire at 400 to 600 meters, well beyond the effective range of .50 caliber machine guns, which were accurate to approximately 300 meters. The tail gunner saw muzzle flashes and tracer rounds streaking toward the aircraft before he could return effective fire. The first indication of being under attack was often impacts, cannon shells striking the fuselage, shrapnel tearing through aluminum, and the sound of metal being shredded. The tail gunner returned fire as soon as the enemy entered range. He fired short bursts, 3 to 5 rounds per trigger pull, to conserve ammunition and prevent the guns from overheating. Aiming was instinctive. There was no time for precise calculations. The gunner pointed the guns where the fighter would be in the next second and fired. Tracers from his own guns showed whether he was on target. Corrections were made instantly. The engagement lasted seconds. The German fighter closed to point-blank range, sometimes less than 100 meters, fired a final burst, and broke away to avoid collision. The tail gunner continued firing until the fighter was out of range or out of sight. In a coordinated attack, multiple fighters attacked in sequence, approaching from different angles. The tail gunner engaged each in turn, swinging the guns from target to target, firing until ammunition ran low or the guns jammed. Successful defense was measured in survival, not kills. The tail gunner's primary objective was to make attacking the aircraft costly enough that German pilots chose other targets. If the tail gunner hit an attacking fighter, forced it to break off early, or made the pilot flinch, he had succeeded. Confirmed kills were rare. Most fighters that were hit continued flying. The tail gunner rarely knew whether he had damaged the enemy. After the attack, the tail gunner assessed damage to his position and reported to the crew. He checked his guns, cleared jams, and reloaded ammunition boxes. If he was wounded, he treated himself as best he could with the first aid kit stowed in the compartment. If equipment was damaged, he improvised repairs. Then he resumed watching the sky, knowing another attack could come at any moment. When a tail gunner was hit by enemy fire, the consequences were immediate and often fatal. The tail position offered no protection. Cannon shells and machine gun bullets penetrated the thin fuselage skin and struck the gunner directly. The confined space meant there was no room to evade or take cover. The gunner was either hit or he was not. There were no near misses in the tail. Wounds varied depending on the type of fire. Machine gun bullets, 13 millimeters from German fighters, caused puncture wounds, shattered bones, and severe bleeding. A hit to the torso or head was usually fatal. A hit to the limbs was survivable but incapacitating. The tail gunner could not leave the position during flight, so even survivable wounds were life-threatening if bleeding could not be controlled. Cannon shells, 20 millimeters or 30 millimeters high-explosive rounds, caused catastrophic damage. A direct hit to the tail gunner or the tail position often killed the gunner instantly. Cannon shells exploded on impact, sending shrapnel through the compartment. The explosion shredded flesh, severed limbs, and destroyed equipment. In some cases, the tail section of the aircraft was completely destroyed, separating from the fuselage. The tail gunner fell with the wreckage. If the tail gunner was wounded but alive, he had to treat himself. The first aid kit included bandages, morphine, and sulfa powder for infections. The gunner applied pressure to wounds to stop bleeding, injected morphine to manage pain, and bandaged injuries as best he could. The cold helped slow bleeding, but also increased the risk of shock and hypothermia. Wounded tail gunners often went into shock, losing consciousness and dying before the aircraft returned to base. Communication with the crew was critical. The wounded tail gunner reported his condition over the intercom. The pilot and other crew members could not provide direct assistance, but could talk the gunner through self-treatment or make decisions about the mission. If the tail gunner was incapacitated, the aircraft lost its rear defense. The pilot had to decide whether to continue the mission or abort and return to base. Some tail gunners remained at their position despite severe wounds, continuing to operate the guns until they lost consciousness or died. These acts were documented in combat reports and sometimes resulted in posthumous awards for valor.
The tail gunner's refusal to abandon his position, even when fatally wounded, was considered essential to the survival of the crew. If the tail gunner was killed, his body remained in the position until the aircraft landed. The crew could not retrieve him during flight. When the aircraft returned to base, ground crews removed the body. In some cases, the tail section was so heavily damaged that recovery was impossible. The tail gunner's remains were left in the wreckage, identified later through serial numbers or personal effects. Tail gunners developed strategies to increase their chances of survival. These were tactical, psychological, and practical measures learned through experience or passed down from veterans. Tactically, experienced tail gunners learned to anticipate German attacks. They watched for patterns, fighters approaching from high altitude, specific formations, or repeated attacks from the same direction. Early detection allowed the gunner to begin tracking the target sooner and open fire at maximum effective range. Firing early sometimes deterred attacks or forced the enemy to break off prematurely. Tail gunners also practiced gun discipline. Ammunition was limited, approximately 500 rounds per gun. Firing continuously would exhaust ammunition in under a minute. Experienced gunners fired short, controlled bursts and conserved ammunition for critical moments. They aimed for the fighter's engine or cockpit, vulnerable areas where a few hits could disable the aircraft. Random spraying of bullets was ineffective and wasteful. Psychologically, tail gunners coped with fear and isolation through mental routines. Some focused on the mechanics of the job, loading guns, tracking targets, firing, reducing the mission to a series of tasks that could be completed one at a time. Others relied on superstition, lucky charms, rituals, or prayers performed before each mission. Some dissociated emotionally, treating the mission as an impersonal technical exercise rather than a life-or-death situation. Crew cohesion was important. Tail gunners who felt connected to their crew, who trusted the pilots, respected the other gunners, and believed in the mission, coped better than those who felt isolated or expendable. Veteran tail gunners mentored new replacements, sharing survival tips and offering reassurance. This mentorship reduced the psychological burden on new gunners and improved their chances of survival. Physical preparation helped. Tail gunners who stayed physically fit, practiced operating the guns in cold conditions, and maintained their equipment had better survival rates. Pre-mission checks ensured that heated suits, oxygen systems, and weapons functioned properly. Equipment failures often resulted in casualties that could have been prevented with proper maintenance. Acceptance of risk was necessary. Tail gunners who obsessed over the danger or constantly calculated their odds of survival experienced debilitating fear. Those who accepted that survival was partly luck and focused on what they could control, accurate shooting, equipment maintenance, communication with the crew, functioned more effectively under stress. Despite these strategies, survival was never guaranteed. Tail gunners completed their required number of missions, typically 25 combat missions for the 8th Air Force, and were rotated out of combat duty. Many did not survive to complete their tour. Statistical analysis of B-17 crew casualties confirms that tail gunners had the highest casualty rate of any crew position. Studies conducted by the Army Air Forces during and after the war analyzed losses by position and mission type. The data showed that tail gunners were killed or severely wounded at rates 20 to 30% higher than pilots or bombardiers, and significantly higher than waist gunners or radio operators. The casualty rate varied by theater and time period. During 1943, when the 8th Air Force conducted unescorted daylight raids deep into Germany, tail gunner casualties were highest. Missions to heavily defended targets, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Berlin, resulted in catastrophic losses. Some missions saw tail gunner casualty rates exceeding 50% among aircraft that returned to base. Aircraft shot down had 100% tail gunner fatalities, as the tail section was usually destroyed first. The introduction of long-range P-51 Mustang escort fighters in 1944 reduced bomber losses and improved tail gunner survival rates. Fighter escorts engaged German interceptors before they reached the bombers, reducing the number and intensity of attacks. Tail gunners on escorted missions faced fewer engagements and had better survival odds. However, even with escorts, tail gunners remained at higher risk than other crew positions. Tail gunners who survived their combat tours carried physical and psychological scars. Frostbite injuries resulted in amputations of fingers, toes, or feet. Hearing loss from prolonged exposure to machine gun fire was common. Post-traumatic stress, called combat fatigue during the war, affected many tail gunners. Nightmares, hypervigilance, and difficulty adjusting to civilian life were reported. The legacy of B-17 tail gunners is one of courage and sacrifice. They occupied the most dangerous position on the aircraft, knowing that they would be targeted first and that their chances of survival were lower than any other crew member. They accepted this risk because the tail gun position was essential to the bomber's defense. Without tail gunners, bombers were defenseless against rear attacks. The survival of the crew depended on the tail gunner's willingness to fight despite impossible odds. Memorials to 8th Air Force personnel honor tail gunners alongside other crew members. Museums display tail gun positions, allowing visitors to understand the cramped, isolated conditions. Veteran tail gunners who survived the war have shared their experiences through memoirs and interviews. Their accounts emphasize the cold, the fear, and the knowledge that they were expendable, but necessary. The experience of B-17 tail gunners represents one of the most hazardous roles in aerial combat during World War II. They faced enemy fire, extreme cold, isolation, and psychological stress in a position designed to absorb the first and most concentrated attacks. Most survived their tours through skill, luck, and the support of their crews. Many did not. Their sacrifice was essential to the success of the strategic bombing campaign and the eventual Allied victory.